Premier Brad Wall checking in. The Premier just back in the past day from Niagara-on-the-Lake. A swing through Ontario, popping into the Canadian Open, which, of course, is in and around Toronto, where Saskatchewan's Graham Dillette profiled the new thinksask.ca logo, which a group of businesses have ponied up the cash to essentially have as a sponsor of Graham Dillette. And the thinksask.ca is a government website, so the idea is people see it and drive traffic. The Premier was involved in an announcement there at the Canadian Open, and then on to a 3-day meeting at Niagara-on-the-Lake. It's called the Council of the Federation, which is really a fancy name for a Premier's Conference. Every summer, one of the provinces hosts this. You have the Premiers of all 10 provinces and the 3 territories getting together to talk about current issues. We find Premier Brad Wall back in his home base of Swift Current this morning. Premier, thanks for taking our call.
John, thanks for the time.
You've talked about the agenda. You know, you hear about the missing Aboriginal women inquiry, federal intrusion into job training, Senate reform abolition, update on block purchases of pharmaceuticals. Do you run the risk of these agendas getting pretty clogged?
Absolutely. The summer premiers meeting, and we should get back to calling it that because, people think they've missed the latest Star Trek movie when they hear the Council of the Federation is meeting. But, the summer premiers meeting typically has about a day and a half of Canadian, sort of provincial to federal issues, economic issues. The very first day, though, we meet separate from that formal meeting with all the national Aboriginal leaders. And that's also a very good meeting where so we canvass a number of issues, in this case, joining a call for inquiry into missing and murdered Aboriginal women. Also, staking out our positions. There are some provinces that are doing the formulaic natural resource revenue sharing deal with First Nations. We campaign on something quite the opposite. We believe that we already share the resource revenue with everyone in the province, First Nation and non-First Nation, and there won't be a special deal. But still, it's a good discussion to have. Then we get into the meetings themselves, and you're right. I mean, my concern has always been that we have such a packed agenda, and we're all guilty of it. We always want to add in our own pieces, but some provinces seem to want to add a little bit more in than others. And what you get at the end of the day, I think, is just a long list of things to talk about. We need to remember as governments, as premiers, that we're there on behalf of our respective citizens, and we're spending their money to get there and to stay there. And if we're more focused and we have a point, like we've tried to have with this healthcare working group Premier Giz and I co-chaired, that's, although imperfect as well, that's the kind of thing we need to move to. Deadlines, objectives, deliverables for Canadians.
Now, did you overreach on the Senate issue? When you look back on this, I mean, it was good, I think you took it on, but was it an overreach by a Western, relatively small province to try and profile Senate abolition?
Well, we weren't reaching for consensus. We weren't even reaching to have anybody, quote unquote, come on board. We wanted to put it on the table. Canadians are talking about the Senate. This is a national table of premiers. And if we're not going to sort of talk about the Senate there and what might be possible to fix it or to get rid of it, then where do we ever discuss these things? So, I think what happened in the media is for some, not all, some portrayed this as some sort of campaign to have the Senate abolished by, yesterday at 5 o'clock. We wanted to raise the issue. And we did that in the course of raising other priorities for Saskatchewan, including the healthcare piece, including cyberbullying. We were going to make the case as to why we had moved from reforming the Senate, which would be preferable, but I just believe impossible, to a position of abolition.
Now, I'm curious. I mean, if the Supreme Court holds the 7 provinces constituting 50% of the population amending formula, so we'll assume that as a given, you need either Quebec or Ontario. And with Premier Wynne, who succeeds Premier McGuinty, what was your sense of her? I mean, is there any appetite in Ontario for Senate abolition?
Well, there sure was under Premier McGuinty, and so therefore I guess there would be under a number of the governing Liberals, but not the Premier. That was my estimation. In fact, I think that there was more interest in terms of abolishing, or at least maybe disdain for the Senate as an institution from Quebec, from Premier Marois, than there was from Ontario. And, John, the context for this, and even as I talked about it a couple, at the end of the meetings at a working breakfast, the context for Saskatchewan is this. This is not in the top 10 most important issues, not even probably in the top 20 most important issues we face in this province. But it is a national meeting, and it is a national issue, and a growing concern for Canadians. And so I just think it was the right spot to talk about these things. Again, it's actually talking about an issue for which we have, even though people don't like it, a prescription. We proposed something that we could do about the Senate. That's what I think these premiers meetings should be. Typically, they get to be about process and reports, even the Canadian energy strategy, and which has been worked on and called for by some provinces. We supported that, but always the caveat was, are we going to write another report? Because these reports tend to be, here's what we're all doing in energy, in renewables, in non-renewables, in transporting the energy. What is the point of that exactly? We have said, let's support and focus on projects like the West-East Pipeline. That's a Canadian energy strategy in action, moving Saskatchewan oil to Atlantic Canada so they can pay a lower West Texas price. Let's talk about transmitting electrons across the country. The transmission of hydroelectricity, perhaps. That's the energy strategy in action. What we do too often is just list things, and I'm not spending my money to be there, and we're not spending our own resources. These are taxpayers' dollars. We should make sure we have a point. There's a great scene in the movie you probably are familiar with John Candy and Steve Martin, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, where Steve Martin tells John Candy very effectively that his stories are nice, but he should try having a point. I think premiers need to remember that as well.
Premier Brad Wall, okay, before you go, I had energy on my list. Keystone XL, which in light of the New York Times interview on the weekend, I fail to see how this thing has a sniff of a chance with President Obama. Gateway North being hamstrung by the hearings by the Canadian Energy Commission, or the Environmental Review. Now we're talking Energy East. If you looked at those three pipelines, what do you see as the likelihood, and where is Saskatchewan's best bet?
Well, I think the Pipeline East is most important for our province. That was always the case because it actually will have Sask oil in that pipeline. It'll mean some investments in terms of capacity for the pipeline on the east side of Saskatchewan. It means capital investments and job creation. All of them are important because they close the differential between West Texas and Brent, although, as you know, that differential has been closing of late, at least in the short term. But more Western Canadian oil to Tidewater is important for Canada if we're aspirants to be a Canadian energy superpower, and we ought to be. We are. So they're all important, but that west-to-east piece is very much more of a direct impact on our own economy. I hear what the president said as well in the interview. Not helpful, maybe not hopeful for some. Maybe this is naive. I still believe this thing is going to go ahead. I believe the project will be approved. I'm not sure why he'd sort of engage in facts that, just frankly, I don't think anybody necessarily agrees with in terms of the economic impact of it down there. But I think with two State Department reports saying that this is not a major environmental concern, in fact, their own U.S. analysis saying that the jobs are there to be created in the U.S. at the numbers that were initially estimated, I'm still hopeful. The other one, the Gateway, I don't know. I'm not quite as hopeful there. There might need to be a do-over here down the road.
Premier, good having you by. Thanks for the check-in, and great chatting again.
John, all the best. Take care.
Premier Brad Wall, back from the Premier's Conference